I want to start with something you might not notice unless you look closely at the shipping label on your next package, because it tells a story about the American economy that Washington is trying very hard to ignore. That book you ordered from Amazon, that pair of shoes from an online retailer, or that electronics gadget arriving at your doorstep likely did not ship from an American warehouse anymore. Look at the origin city on the tracking information. You're going to see Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal. Increasingly, the packages Americans order online are coming from Canada. This is not because Canadian companies suddenly woke up and decided to dominate e-commerce through innovation or superior marketing. It is happening because American e-commerce giants like Amazon, Walmart, Shopify, and Target have quietly and aggressively relocated their distribution infrastructure north of the border. If you had told anyone 5 years ago that the majority of North American e-commerce logistics would flow through Canadian hubs rather than massive American fulfillment centers, they would have dismissed you as delusional. E-commerce was an American invention. Amazon created the model. American consumers drove the growth. The United States possessed the largest, most sophisticated logistics network in the world, but that network is collapsing right now, and I am here to tell you that the reason is not competition from abroad or some technological disruption we failed to see coming. It is policy. It is a self-inflicted wound. Specifically, it is the result of President Donald Trump's decision to impose a 15% tax on all online sales, to create Byzantine interstate commerce regulations that make shipping across state lines a compliance nightmare, and to reclassify gig economy workers as W-2 employees. Those policies were sold to the American public with a very specific spin. We were told they would protect local retail. We were told they would ensure worker protections. We were told they would level the playing field, but the hard reality is that they have had the exact opposite effect. They have made American e-commerce uncompetitive. They have driven companies to relocate their entire operations, and they have destroyed the very jobs they were supposed to protect. Canada, recognizing the opportunity we handed them on a silver platter, moved with remarkable speed to become the e-commerce capital of North America. They are not just attracting a few distribution centers here and there. They are becoming the logistics backbone of an entire continent, and the workers, the warehouse supervisors, the gig drivers, the small business owners who built their lives around this industry are learning a brutal lesson. Even industries that seem inherently domestic, industries that seem rooted in our local economy, can relocate when governments make them impossible to operate profitably. When they do move, entire regional economies shift with them. What happened officially looks on paper like a straightforward attempt to help struggling retail. In early 2025, Trump signed the Fair E-commerce Act. It was billed as a sweeping piece of legislation designed to save Main Street. The centerpiece of this legislation was a 15% federal tax on all online transactions. And let's be clear about how this tax works, because the details matter. It was not a tax on the platform's profit. It was a tax on the gross sale price. If you bought a $50 item online, the retailer owed the federal government $7.50 right off the top. The stated goal was to offset the perceived advantages online retailers had over physical stores, which paid property taxes and employed local workers. But in an industry that operates on razor-thin margins, a 15% tax on gross revenue is not an adjustment. It is a death sentence. It turned profitable transactions into losses overnight, but the tax was only the first pillar of this policy disaster. The second part of the legislation imposed strict new interstate commerce regulations. For decades, the engine of American e-commerce was the ability to ship freely across state lines with minimal paperwork. It was the United States acting as a single, unified market. Trump's policy shattered that. It required detailed manifests for every single shipment crossing state borders. It demanded compliance with varying state-level product regulations and mandatory registration in every state where a company delivered goods. For a company like Amazon, which ships to all 50 states, this meant navigating 50 different regulatory frameworks, each with its own rules, fees, and reporting requirements. The administrative burden was staggering. It required armies of lawyers and compliance officers just to move a box from Nevada to California. Then there was the third component, which targeted the gig economy. For years, companies like Amazon Flex, Instacart, and DoorDash relied on independent contractors. These were people who used their own vehicles, set their own hours, and worked flexibly. The labor policy within the Fair E-commerce Act reclassified these workers as W-2 employees. This meant companies had to provide full benefits, withhold taxes, pay minimum wage guarantees, and cover workers' compensation insurance. While this was framed as a victory for workers' rights and a way to stop exploitation, the economic effect was to increase labor costs by as much as 40%. It made the gig model, which allowed millions of people to earn supplemental income on flexible schedules and enabled same-day delivery, economically unviable. The cumulative impact of these three policies was catastrophic for American e-commerce. The 15% tax ate directly into margins. The interstate regulations added crushing compliance costs that smaller retailers simply could not afford. Only the largest companies had the infrastructure to even attempt to navigate the complexity, and even they struggled to make the math work. The gig worker reclassification made the delivery services customers had come to expect prohibitively expensive. Companies responded the only way they could. They are profit-seeking entities, not charities. They started shutting down American operations and looking for an exit. While American e-commerce was collapsing under this regulatory pressure, Canada was building an alternative. Mark Carney, a man who knows a thing or two about global finance and strategy, understood immediately that e-commerce is not just about convenience for consumers, it is infrastructure. It is logistics networks, distribution hubs, data systems, payment processing, and last-mile delivery. It is one of the defining industries of the 21st century. He realized that whoever controls it shapes how goods move across continents. If the United States was going to make e-commerce unviable through taxation and regulation, Carney decided that Canada would create the conditions for it to thrive. He announced a comprehensive e-commerce development strategy that was breathtaking in its scope and speed. He committed $15 billion over 10 years to build logistics infrastructure, streamline customs processes, and support companies relocating from the United States. But he went further than just spending money. He guaranteed zero federal taxes on e-commerce transactions, not reduced taxes. Zero. If you sold a product online and shipped it from Canada, you paid no federal tax on the transaction. He eliminated interprovincial trade barriers, making it as easy to ship from Vancouver to Toronto as it was to ship within a single city. He preserved the flexibility of gig work, allowing companies to continue using independent contractors without reclassification mandates. And most critically, he negotiated automatic customs clearance for packages crossing the U.S.-Canada border. This was a streamlined process that allowed goods to flow south with minimal delay or paperwork. The response from the market was immediate and overwhelming. Within months, Amazon began announcing the closures of American fulfillment centers and the opening of massive new facilities in Canada. Walmart followed suit. Shopify expanded aggressively. Target moved operations to Vancouver. Thousands of smaller businesses followed them. Let me show you what this looks like for the people living through it. Meet Carlos. He is 33 years old, worked at Amazon for 8 years. He started as a warehouse associate, picking and packing orders in a massive fulfillment center in Southern California. Over the years, he moved up. He became a team lead, then a supervisor, managing a crew of 40 workers responsible for processing thousands of orders per shift. He loved the work. It was fast-paced, physically demanding, but it had structure, clear metrics, opportunities for advancement. He made $67,000 a year, had full benefits, owned a small condo, was saving for his kids' education. He thought he would stay at Amazon for decades, maybe move into management, build a career. In early 2025, everything changed. Trump's Fair E-commerce Act went into effect. The 15% tax hit immediately. Carlos started noticing changes within weeks. Shipping volumes dropped. Customers were ordering less because prices had risen to cover the tax. Then Amazon announced it was consolidating operations, closing underperforming fulfillment centers to cut costs. Carlos's facility was on the list. The company explained that the new tax made it impossible to maintain the same number of warehouses. They were shutting down 15 centers across the United States, laying off over 20,000 workers. Carlos got the call in June. His facility would close in 90 days. He was offered a choice. He could take severance, 6 months of pay and benefits, or he could apply for a transfer to one of Amazon's remaining U.S. facilities. But those facilities were in different states, and there were no openings for supervisors. He would have to move and take a demotion back to a warehouse associate role at lower pay. Or, the recruiter mentioned almost casually, Amazon was opening new fulfillment centers in Canada, Vancouver specifically. They were hiring supervisors, offering competitive salaries, and providing relocation assistance. The salary was 58,000 Canadian dollars, which converted to about 43,000 US, less than he was making now. But Carlos was also told that the cost of living in Vancouver, while high, was manageable, and the benefits included things American workers paid for separately, like health care. Carlos was torn. Moving to another country felt overwhelming. He had family in California, his kids were in school, his wife had a job, but he also knew that his options in the United States were limited. E-commerce was contracting. Amazon was not the only company closing warehouses. Walmart had announced closures. Target was scaling back. If Carlos wanted to stay in the field, he knew he had to go where the work was, and right now that was Canada. Carlos and his family moved to Vancouver in September. The transition was harder than he expected. Vancouver is expensive. Housing costs were higher than California, which he had not anticipated, but other costs were lower. Healthcare was covered. Childcare was subsidized. Public transit was excellent. So he sold one of their cars, and the job itself was better than he had hoped. Amazon's Vancouver facility was state-of-the-art, newly built with the latest automation and robotics. Carlos was managing a larger team, 50 workers instead of 40, and the company was investing heavily in training and development. Within 6 months, Carlos had been promoted to operations manager, overseeing multiple departments. His salary increased to $72,000 Canadian dollars, about 54,000 US, still less than he had made in California. But his family was stable, his job was secure, and he was no longer worried that the facility would close due to political decisions. Now, let me show you the other side of this shift, because for every worker like Carlos who found opportunity in Canada, there are thousands in the United States who stayed and watched their jobs disappear. Meet Sandra. She is 28 years old, runs a small e-commerce business from Texas. Sandra started her company 5 years ago, selling handmade jewelry online through Shopify. It began as a side project, something she did in the evenings while working a corporate job, but the business grew. She built a following on social media. Her designs were unique. Orders started coming in faster than she could make them. 2 years ago, she quit her job and went full-time. She was making $75,000 a year. Not rich, but enough to live comfortably, pay her rent, save a little. She loved the autonomy, the creativity, the direct connection with customers. When Trump's Fair E-commerce Act passed, Sandra's business collapsed almost overnight. The 15% tax applied to every sale. She could not absorb it. Her margins were already thin, so she raised prices. A necklace that sold for $50 was now $60 after tax. Her sales dropped by 40% within 2 months. Customers were price sensitive. They went to cheaper alternatives or stopped buying jewelry altogether. Sandra tried to adjust, cutting costs, streamlining operations, but there was no way to make the math work. She was losing money every month. Then Sandra learned about other small business owners who had moved their operations to Canada. Shopify, the platform she used, was Canadian, and it offered a program to help sellers relocate. If Sandra registered her business in Canada, she could sell to American customers without the 15% tax. The shipments would come from Canada, cross the border with automatic customs clearance, and reach customers faster than they had from Texas because Canada's logistics infrastructure was prioritized. Sandra was skeptical. Moving her business to Canada sounded complicated, but she also knew she did not have a choice. Her business was dying. In October, she flew to Toronto, met with a business advisor, and registered her company in Ontario. The process took 3 days. She rented a small commercial space to store inventory, set up shipping through a Canadian logistics provider, and redirected her Shopify store to reflect the new location. The cost was about $5,000, less than she had expected. The impact was immediate. Without the 15% tax, Sandra could lower her prices back to where they had been. Her sales rebounded. Within 3 months, she was making more than she had before the tax because Canadian e-commerce infrastructure was faster and cheaper, shipping costs were lower, customs was automated, and because she was now operating from Canada, she could sell to international markets more easily. European customers who had avoided her store due to high U.S. shipping costs were now buying because Canadian shipping rates were lower. By the end of her first year in Canada, Sandra's revenue had tripled. She hired 2 employees to help with production and fulfillment. She moved to Toronto permanently, renting an apartment near her workspace, and she started advising other American small business owners on how to make the same transition. For Sandra, the move to Canada was not just about survival, it was about growth. She had found an environment where e-commerce could thrive, where policies supported entrepreneurs instead of strangling them. The contrast between Carlos and Sandra reveals something essential about this moment. Carlos, with his warehouse management skills, had options, but they required relocation and accepting lower pay initially. He made the move because he had no better alternatives in the United States. But for workers who could not relocate, who had family obligations, who lacked transferable skills, the collapse of American e-commerce meant permanent job loss. Meanwhile, Sandra, with a flexible digital business model, found it relatively easy to move. Her business did not depend on physical location. She could operate from anywhere with internet and logistics access. And by moving to Canada, she unlocked growth she could never have achieved under American tax policy. Now let's zoom out and look at the structural forces reshaping e-commerce, because understanding how this industry works is essential to understanding why Trump's policies were so destructive. E-commerce is fundamentally about logistics. It is not just about building websites or taking orders online. It is about moving physical goods from warehouses to customers as quickly and cheaply as possible, and that requires infrastructure, distribution centers strategically located near population hubs, transportation networks, trucks, planes, trains, technology systems that track inventory, optimize routes, manage deliveries, and regulatory environments that allow goods to move freely without excessive friction. For decades, the United States had the best e-commerce infrastructure in the world. Amazon built the model. Massive fulfillment centers located within hours of major cities, sophisticated algorithms that predicted demand and positioned inventory close to customers, partnerships with carriers like UPS and FedEx, and a legal environment that, while imperfect, allowed companies to operate across state lines without crippling bureaucracy. Trump's Fair E-commerce Act destroyed that system. The 15% tax was not just a revenue measure. It was a structural change that made e-commerce less competitive than traditional retail. And because e-commerce operates on thin margins, small percentage changes have enormous impacts. A 15% tax can turn a profitable business model into a loss-making one. The interstate commerce regulations added friction at every step. Suddenly, shipping from California to Texas required different paperwork than shipping from California to Nevada. Companies had to hire compliance teams just to navigate state-level rules. And the gig worker reclassification eliminated the flexibility that had made fast delivery economically viable. When drivers had to be W-2 employees, companies could not scale up or down based on demand. They had to maintain full-time staff even during slow periods, driving up fixed costs. Canada understood that e-commerce success depends on removing friction, not adding it. Carney's strategy was simple. Make it as easy as possible for goods to move. No transaction taxes, no interprovincial barriers, streamlined customs for cross-border shipments, and labor flexibility that allowed companies to use the staffing models that worked best for their operations. The results were staggering. In less than 2 years, Canada went from handling a small fraction of North American e-commerce logistics to handling the majority. Amazon's largest fulfillment centers are now in Vancouver and Toronto. Walmart's primary distribution hubs for online orders are in Canada. Shopify, already a Canadian company, expanded its fulfillment network across Ontario and British Columbia. And thousands of smaller logistics companies, trucking firms, warehousing operations, courier services, all relocated or expanded into Canada to support the boom. The ripple effects extend far beyond the companies themselves. Communities that hosted large fulfillment centers, towns in California, Texas, Ohio, Pennsylvania, are seeing economic decline. When an Amazon warehouse closes, it does not just eliminate jobs at the facility, It affects the entire local economy. Trucking companies lose contracts, restaurants near the warehouse lose customers, real estate values drop, tax revenue shrinks, schools and public services face budget cuts. The closure of a single large fulfillment center can devastate a small town. Meanwhile, Canadian communities are booming. Richmond, a suburb of Vancouver, has become a logistics hub. Warehouses are going up rapidly. Housing is being built to accommodate workers. New businesses are opening to serve the growing population. The same pattern is visible in Mississauga near Toronto and in suburbs of Montreal. These communities are experiencing growth not seen in decades. But there is another dimension to this story, and it has to do with the gig economy. Trump's reclassification of gig workers as W-2 employees was supposed to protect vulnerable workers from exploitation, and in some cases it did. Workers who had been treated as contractors without benefits now had health care and job protections. But for many others, the policy eliminated opportunities. People who had relied on gig work for supplemental income, parents working around childcare schedules, students earning money between classes, retirees staying active, suddenly found that those opportunities were gone. Companies simply could not afford to hire everyone as full-time employees, so they cut the workforce, reduced hours, and made do with fewer workers. In Canada, gig work remained flexible. Companies could still use independent contractors, drivers could still set their own hours, and workers appreciated the autonomy. Yes, they did not have the same benefits as full-time employees, but they had freedom, the ability to work when it suited them, to earn extra income without committing to a rigid schedule. For many people, that flexibility was more valuable than mandated benefits that came with loss of control over their time. You deserve better than this. You deserve leaders who understand that industries built on efficiency and flexibility cannot survive under policies that prioritize ideological goals over economic reality. Carlos deserves better. Sandra deserves better. The thousands of workers who lost jobs because warehouses closed. The small business owners who had to choose between relocating or shutting down. They all deserve better. Canada did not steal American e-commerce. Canada built an alternative because American policy made e-commerce unviable in the United States. The 15% tax, the interstate regulations, the gig worker mandates, all of them were designed with good intentions. But good intentions without understanding of how industries actually operate lead to disaster. And until American leaders recognize that punitive taxation, regulatory complexity, and rigid labor rules drive companies away rather than protecting workers, this trend will continue. American e-commerce is not dead, but it is no longer leading. Packages are crossing the border from north to south, reversing a flow that had defined the continent for decades. And the workers who built the logistics networks, who picked and packed millions of orders, who delivered packages to doorsteps, are learning that even industries that seem inherently local can relocate when governments make them impossible. That is the lesson of America's e-commerce collapse. And it is a lesson written on every shipping label coming from Vancouver for everyone to see. But there is another worker whose story deserves attention because it reveals how the gig economy reclassification affected people who were never asking for W-2 status in the first place. Meet Maria. She is 41 years old, lives in Phoenix, Arizona. Maria works as a nurse full-time at a local hospital, 40 hours a week on rotating shifts. The pay is decent, $58,000 a year, but Arizona is expensive, and Maria is a single mother with 2 kids. Her nursing salary covers the basics, rent, food, utilities, but there is never much left over. So for 3 years, Maria drove for DoorDash in her off hours, a few evenings a week, weekend mornings, whenever her schedule allowed. She made an extra $1,000 to $2,500 a month, enough to cover her kids' extracurricular activities, build a small emergency fund, occasionally take them to a movie or a restaurant. The gig work was perfect for Maria because it was flexible. She could turn the app on when she had time and turn it off when she did not. Some weeks she worked 10 hours, some weeks she worked none. It fit around her nursing shifts, around her kids' schedules, around her life. She was not looking to make DoorDash a career. It was supplemental income that gave her family a little breathing room. When Trump's labor policy reclassified gig workers as W-2 employees, DoorDash faced a choice. They could not afford to hire every driver as a full-time employee with benefits. The economics did not work, so they drastically reduced their driver pool, keeping only those who could commit to consistent schedules, effectively turning gig work into shift work. Maria, with her nursing job and unpredictable availability, no longer qualified. Her application to stay on as a W-2 employee was denied because she could not commit to minimum weekly hours. Maria lost her supplemental income overnight. That $1,000 to $1,500 a month gone. She tried other gig platforms, Uber, Instacart, but they all faced the same regulatory pressure and made the same cuts. The flexible income opportunities that had existed for millions of Americans simply disappeared. Maria had to cut back. Her daughter's dance classes stopped. Her son's soccer league dropped. The small emergency fund she had been building depleted within months to cover unexpected expenses. Maria was not better off under the new policy. She was worse off. She had not been exploited as a contractor. She had been empowered by flexibility. And when that flexibility was eliminated in the name of protecting her, she lost the very thing that had made her financial life manageable. And most Americans ordering packages online have no idea any of this happened. They click buy, and 2 days later a box appears on their doorstep. They do not look at the shipping label. They do not notice that the origin city has changed from California or Texas to Vancouver or Toronto. They do not think about the warehouse worker who lost a job, the gig driver who lost flexibility, the small business owner who had to relocate to survive. The system still works for consumers, at least for now. Packages still arrive, but the infrastructure supporting that convenience has fundamentally shifted. And once that shift is complete, once American logistics capacity has been dismantled and Canadian infrastructure becomes the default, reversing it will be nearly impossible. That is the danger of policy that sounds good in speeches but ignores how industries actually function. By the time the consequences become visible to ordinary people, the damage is already done. We are left with empty warehouses, struggling towns, and a neighbor to the north that realize the future of commerce belongs to those who make it easier to do business, not harder.